Elizabeth Holmes was a 19-year-old Stanford University dropout who had a vision of revolutionizing blood testing when she founded Theranos. By 2014, this healthcare technology company was valued at an impressive $9 billion, surpassing Uber and Spotify in valuations. Holmes was hailed as a pioneering visionary in Silicon Valley, likened to the likes of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. The company was touted as a game changer in the blood testing industry, but it turned out to be too good to be true. Despite the hype and promise of a medical revolution, Theranos was a deception, resulting in patient safety being compromised and its founders being imprisoned. Elizabeth Holmes, once a Silicon Valley superstar, will spend over a decade in prison for fraud. In this account of one of the most bizarre and bewildering medical cons of all time, we will delve into the real motive behind a false pledge to save lives, as well as the intricate personalities that propelled Theranos. Elizabeth grew up in a family with an impressive lineage of achievements, including a renowned surgeon great-great-grandfather, a father who was a vice president at an energy company in Rome, and a mother who worked as a staffer on congressional committees. With such a background, attending Stanford University was an obvious choice for Elizabeth, who had already established connections at the prestigious institution. Her goal was to obtain a degree in chemical engineering and make a difference in the world. During the summer between her freshman and sophomore years at Stanford, Elizabeth worked at the Genome Institute of Singapore, where she assisted in the fight against SARS by conducting nasal swab testing. However, Elizabeth found the method uncomfortable for patients and began exploring alternative ways to make the testing process more convenient and comfortable for those in need. This experience sparked her ambition to revolutionize the medical industry. She began contemplating alternative ways to make the process more convenient. Upon returning to California, Elizabeth sketched the design for a small wearable arm patch that could diagnose and treat various illnesses, inspired by her exposure to lab-on-a-chip technology at Stanford University. Elizabeth's ideal patch would detect a virus and administer the appropriate antibiotic in doses that were adjusted according to variables in the patient's blood. The patch would also wirelessly update doctors on the patient's status. Although Stanford's then Dean of Engineering, Channing Robertson, praised the concept, not everyone shared his optimism. When Elizabeth approached Professor of Medicine Phyllis Gardner with her proposal, Gardner expressed doubts about its feasibility. According to her, a tiny patch that could diagnose and begin treating a patient's ailment defied the laws of physics. But this didn't stop Elizabeth from filing a patent and hiring Stanford lab students to build the prototype, putting together this semblance of a small company. Elizabeth dropped out of Stanford in March 2004 to focus on her startup. With what was left of her tuition money, Elizabeth put everything into her dream of revolutionizing diagnostics. At 19 years old, she founded Real-Time Cures, which would later become Theranos. Initially, the company operated out of the basement of a college house before eventually moving to an office in Palo Alto. Elizabeth's strategy was to emphasize the potential of her technology to change the entire medical industry without going into the technical details. She talked a big game to win over investors who weren't necessarily knowledgeable in medical science. Elizabeth envisioned that her technology could be accessible to everyone, removing the need for lab testing entirely. In 2004, the company was renamed Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. Despite Elizabeth's grand vision, not everyone was convinced, particularly those in the medical field. During one pitch to a venture capitalist firm, Elizabeth was unable to answer basic questions about her device and abruptly left the meeting. She explained the technology as performing a chemistry to generate a signal from a chemical interaction with a sample, which would be translated into a result. However, creating a wearable device that could perform dozens of tests at once posed significant logistical problems. Though Theranos initially focused on diagnostics, Elizabeth's rigid expectations and desire for multiple tests to be conducted simultaneously meant that the device would need to be larger than a wearable arm patch. Because of that, the Theranos team abandoned the idea of a patch and replaced it with a new prototype called the Theranos 1.0. This boxy machine used microfluidic and biochemistry technology with a cartridge and reader system. Though it was not what Elizabeth had originally envisioned, it gave the company something to show potential investors during demonstrations. However, the device didn't actually work, and it was unreliable when it came to providing accurate results. In 2006, Elizabeth and her team traveled to Switzerland to present the Theranos 1.0 to Novartis, a global healthcare company. But one of the two devices Elizabeth brought with them malfunctioned the night before the demo. Rather than being honest about the flaw, Elizabeth had her team send fake test results from California to Switzerland, deceiving investors into thinking that the machines actually worked. The demo appeared successful, but when the CFO found out about the deception and he confronted Elizabeth, she fired him on the spot. Theranos continued to stage demonstrations not just for investors, but also for board members and media personnel, which would have severe consequences in the future. A class action lawsuit filed by the people of Arizona a decade later revealed instances of false results leading to incorrect diagnoses, including a woman who was told she was miscarrying when she was still pregnant, a patient who received a false positive on their HIV test, and another who was wrongly instructed to stop taking blood-thinning medication. Despite these alarming consequences, Elizabeth was determined to go commercial as quickly as possible and even used real cancer patients as subjects to test her device's accuracy. In 2007, Elizabeth initiated a 15-month study for Pfizer that evaluated how 27 late-stage cancer patients responded to treatment using Theranos devices. However, the results displayed inconsistent readings that Theranos couldn't explain, and it took the company 2 weeks to respond to Pfizer's inquiry. This led to Pfizer deciding against partnership. In 2009, Elizabeth hired sunnybalwani, a man with no scientific background, as the company's president and COO. What the board and employees were unaware of was that Sunny and Elizabeth were in a secret relationship. Sunny met Elizabeth when she was an 18-year-old senior in high school, and he was pursuing his MBA at Berkeley, and they started living together by 2005. When Balwani joined Theranos, he was known to be overbearing, paranoid, and encouraged employees to work long hours, even if it wasn't productive. Meanwhile, Elizabeth commissioned a former Logitech employee to improve blood sample handling in the lab. Tony Nugent decided automation was the way to go and bought a $3,000 mechanical arm to mimic the movements of a chemist in a lab using only 50 microliters of blood. This machine was later named the Edison, but according to a whistleblower, it was a piece of crap that broke often, causing gears to jam and pipette tips to get stuck. Despite the Edison's issues, Elizabeth pushed to use it and rushed to get faulty products on the market. On the rare times it did work, it only carried out immunoassay tests, which only detect drug levels, hormone levels, and some cancer makers. But their scope was limited, and the Edison could not run the full range of tests. In 2010, Theranos reached out to Walgreens, boasting about the productivity of the Edison and falsely claiming that they had the capability to run any blood test with just a few drops of blood. Walgreens, eager to do away with their slower, more expensive labs, arranged a meeting with Theranos immediately. An agreement was reached for Theranos to use their readers in 30 to 90 Walgreens stores by the middle of 2011. However, nobody from Walgreens was allowed to explore the Theranos labs, as Elizabeth and other top members forbade it. If they had, they would have discovered that it was only an R&D lab for research purposes, and that half the tests they listed could not be performed on the Edison. Safeway also expressed interest in Theranos, which later resulted in deal for a $30 million loan and a revamp of Safeway stores to include new labs that offered blood testing in mere minutes. As Theranos needed access to patients by 2013, Walgreens became their answer. The mini-lab was put aside as they launched the Edison Select Walgreens stores alongside their own website. Elizabeth Holmes, hailed as a role model and compared to the likes of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, managed to raise over $700 million in capital funding from massive investors such as Rupert Murdoch, which raised the value of Theranos to almost $10 billion at its height. Elizabeth herself owned half of the company in 2015, with her net worth estimated at $4.5 billion, making her the youngest billionaire in the world. Elizabeth was dedicated to matching the productivity and creative outlook of her personal role model, Steve Jobs, right down to her clothing, and even referred to her technology as the iPod of healthcare. Despite the glowing praise that Elizabeth Holmes received, the reality was that her Edison device could only detect a fraction of the illnesses advertised. In fact, the company had been secretly buying commercial analyzers from other manufacturers to conduct the vast majority of its tests, rather than using the product they claimed would revolutionize healthcare. The Edison was so unreliable that some employees quit rather than continue using it on real patients. These concerns ultimately led to a whistleblower, Tyler Schultz, reaching out to federal regulators about the company's unethical and illegal practices, including obscuring test results and deleting outliers. Multiple witnesses, including another whistleblower named Erica Chung, testified that the company prioritized speed over lab safety and quality control. Employees were frequently pressured to lie to doctors and regulators, and machines were not recalibrated because it would take too long. Elizabeth Holmes insisted on keeping all information about the company's operations to herself, using the excuse of trade secrets and proprietary information to dismiss any concerns raised by worried employees. Ian Gibbons, who had been with Theranos since 2005 as the chief scientist, had raised concerns about the company from the very beginning. Being an accomplished inventor himself with over 60 patents to his name, Ian did not take his craft lightly and began to notice serious problems with the way the company was run. However, after raising his concerns with Elizabeth and board member Channing Robertson, Ian was fired, rehired, and demoted, all within a couple of hours. When he was eventually issued a court subpoena in an unrelated patent dispute against Elizabeth, Ian became terrified that testifying against his boss would breach the terms of his NDA and result in losing his job. The day before he was set to testify, Ian overdosed on Tylenol and died in the hospital. His wife attributed his death to the hostile culture at Theranos and the intimidation tactics of Elizabeth and Sunny. Elizabeth denied accusations that Theranos was using commercially available equipment for its tests, asserting that their full commitment to transparency was evident by their willingness to voluntarily seek FDA approval. However, Theranos had been operating in a gray zone where, because their tests were considered lab-developed, the FDA had little to no oversight, and that the lab was allowed to sell and advertise the test without the FDA's sign-off. Safeway and Walgreens, the two major partners of Theranos, ended their partnerships due to the company's inability to deliver on its promises. Theranos was forced to lay off hundreds of employees and face a lawsuit from Walgreens for $140 million. In September, Theranos failed a second regulatory lab inspection, leading to the shutdown of its last remaining laboratory. On March 14, 2018, Elizabeth and Sunny were charged with fraud by the SEC for exaggerating or making false statements about the company's technology, business, and financial performance. The complaint alleged that they knew the Edison could only carry out 12 of the 200 tests advertised on its patent testing menu, and that the company lied about its revenue projections and regulatory approval. Furthermore, it was revealed that the company had been using slightly modified third-party machinery without disclosing this fact to the public. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 of the 11 federal charges in her trial, but interestingly, she was acquitted on 4 other charges related to defrauding patients. In November 2022, she was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, while Sunny received a nearly identical sentence the following month. Their sentences ensure that they will spend the next decade behind bars for swindling hundreds of millions of dollars from unsuspecting investors and putting countless innocent lives in danger. This was the tale of Elizabeth Holmes, one of the biggest corporate frauds in history, a story of unchecked ambition and hubris.